the time the interactions of will, mind, and matter. Even though these interactions are beyond our powers fully to comprehend. But, you know, we have the sense of making our bodies move by something that is in itself, at least in our immediate consciousness, not a body. Would not a spirit be akin to will and mind? It's not absurd to say that God is some kind of body that is akin to mind, but that the kind of body and kinship are simply beyond our merely human powers of comprehension. The believer could say then the following: Mr. Hobbes, you can assert so assuredly that there are no spirits because you dogmatically assume that everything is matter in motion and don't even think seriously about the interactions of mind and matter. Philip Claris shows with a stroke that Hobbes' argument is not impregnable. Hobbes doesn't prove the impossibility of spirits. Rather, he shows that if one begins with materialistic presuppositions, that spirit and mind do not exist, one ends up with a materialistic conclusion, that there are no spirits. There's one. Hobbes' dogmatic materialism in no way demonstrably refutes the evidence as presented in the miracle of the drum, especially the experience as reported by an honest and learned man, and not some obvious lunatic, drunk, or fraud, who would not lie since he knew that he would be ridiculed by every unthinking skeptic in the country. Now, Franklin, I have to add, was not a believer, despite the commonplace view that he was. Moreover, he was, his unbelief sprang from a critique of our moral intuitions, which he thought were the background conditions for our sense that we're good enough or worthy enough for something like a God to talk to us. But that notwithstanding, this argument that he makes here is absolutely astounding, because here you have a man who was not a believer telling his friends in that camp that they can't prove their point. So Philo-Claris shows with a stroke that Hobbes' argument is not impregnable. Hobbes doesn't prove the impossibility of spirits. He rather shows that if one begins with materialistic presuppositions, one ends up with a materialistic conclusion. Hobbes' dogmatic materialism in no way demonstrably refutes the evidence presented in the miracle of the drum. Okay? Repeat the point again, especially since the person who reported that was a man that Philo-Claris says was perfectly sane, perfectly reasonable, not crazy. That's always hard for the rationalist to know somebody who they know is not crazy, but who insists that they've experienced the miracle of the Spirit, you know, or something like that. Hobbes, the problem the argument Franklin is making here is that Hobbes and Spinoza and even Bacon simply argue dogmatically that if you believe these things, you're crazy. As Bacon put it, inspiration is an ill disposition of the brain. It's a psychological disease. And that's what Hobbes had just said. People make these things up because they're terrified. And they're terrified of what they don't understand. So if you make people understand, they won't be terrified, they won't believe in these things. Well, that argument, Franklin didn't think cut any ice at all. As the spoof of the devil and his drum reveals, Franklin came to suspect that the standard rationalism of the Enlightenment, which claimed that natural science and metaphysics could prove that miracles don't exist, was really just circular reasoning. In fact, Franklin concluded that rationalistic science could never prove the believers wrong. That's why he took a different tack. He also concluded that the rationalists were very unlikely to admit this fact. They turned out to believe in their rationalism as fervently as believers believed in their miracles. It's a faith that your rationalism is the right assumption, just as it's a faith that your belief is the right assumption. And if you can get the rationalists to admit that yes, they have a faith in rationalism, they lose. Rationalism loses if it's a faith. Well, at least from the standard of rationalism, most seriously considered. However, if one were to push this fact into rationalists' faces, Franklin thought they could get just as angry as good believers about challenges to their faith. So Franklin, it turns out, was a free-thinking critic of Enlightenment and free thinking. Most amazing character. Despite his own powerful skepticism, he didn't think that most partisans of modernity and rationalism could defend themselves intellectually against those who feel the miracle of conscience or the Spirit of God moving within. So for all of his enthusiastic support of the Baconian conquest of nature, Franklin kept a skeptical eye out for the problems that would lie ahead. And the main problem in his mind was theological and religious. Franklin just thought that the roots of religion were so deeply not rooted in psychological disturbance, but in something else, that you can't count on them going away. So in a way, he sort of predicted that the secularization thesis would fail. And by the way, in political science, we're learning that modernization doesn't mean the end of religion. It's just, I know that we thought this was true, but it certainly doesn't. And in case after case after case. 400 years of Francis Bacon, and the arguments are still as ripe as they were in the 17th century. Furthermore, Franklin was aware that the rationalists, with their death-busting powers, could get too big for their britches and think that they're God rather than just get accused of playing God. It's always possible for human beings to be overwhelmed by pride in their power, and he thought that was true of every human being alive, with one exception, Benjamin Franklin, who had to admit that if he did conquer pride, he would be proud of having conquered pride. It's just impossible. So Franklin was not above making fun of the scientific and technological project, which he did almost certainly in 1781, but surely while he was in Passy outside of Paris. While he was there, he wrote a short comical essay called Proposal to the Royal Academy of blah, 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 blah. So it's 4 asterisks, you don't know. It's just a hypothetical Royal Academy. He starts out by saying that the Academy had proposed a prize to be given to the best answer to a mathematical question, because they could not imagine a question of physics that would have more utility for human beings. So Franklin thus proposes a physical question that he says will have such utility. It is well known, says Franklin, that digestion produces great quantities of wind in the bowels, and that permitting it to escape is usually offensive to company because of the awful smell. Well-bred people forcibly restrain the efforts of nature to produce this discharge so as to avoid giving offense, and as a result, suffer great present pain, future diseases, such as colic, ruptures, and tympanites that are often harmful and sometimes fatal. And were it not for the odiously offensive smell, people would not mind discharging their wind in public any more than they mind blowing their noses. So his prize question would therefore be to discover some drug, wholesome and not disagreeable, to be mixed with our common food or sauces that shall render the natural discharges of wind from our bodies not only inoffensive, but agreeable as perfumes. Then follows a hilarious account of why such a project is not foolish and is on the contrary based on real experimental evidence. We already know some means for varying the smell. One who eats meat with lots of onions will afford a stink that no company can tolerate, whereas one who dines only on vegetables shall have that breath so pure as to be insensible to the most delicate noses. And if he can manage so as to avoid the report, he may anywhere give vent to his griefs unnoticed. But since few will choose to be vegetarians, it's worth experimenting to see if something like powder of lime might transform the air in our bowels just as quicklime corrects the fetid air of a privy. After all, he notes, a small pill of turpentine changes the disagreeable smell of asparagus-laced urine to the pleasant odor of violets. The discoverer of the gas pill, he says, will receive immortal honor, which is proved by the fact that other philosophers have achieved fame in much less useful discovery.